Greetings, people. Today on the Vinyl Rundown, it's about to get real because I'm going to show you what might be the most important record in my collection. And it is not a music record. It has nothing to do with music. It is a spoken word record. Before you yawn, let me make my case before you rush to judgment. I'm going to show you a record that's really about a cultural phenomenon that happened in the 60s. And it's about something much bigger than music. It's about politics and media, democracy, journalism, all that stuff. I already gave you a clue what it is. 1967 release of an album, spoken word album called Rush to Judgment by researcher and attorney Mark Lane. And it says, new insights on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, November 1963. I hope most of you know what happened back in 1963. There's Dealey Plaza. Let me give you some background on what this record means and who Mark Lane is and why I think this is a very important record. I found this at a used record store the other day. Was happy to see it for like $7 or $8. So you know, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Dallas, Texas. One of the first things President Johnson did when he got into office is to convene what was called the Warren Commission, headed by Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, plus a bunch of, important white politician dudes who supposedly had a lot of integrity. But we'll get into that. Anyway, they put together their report and released it in 1964, September of 1964. And within 2 years, Mark Lane, the gentleman on this record, put out a book called Rush to Judgment. In addition to the book, he came out with a record and a movie documentary, all surrounding the same concept, was criticizing and analyzing the Warren Commission report. The Warren Commission report came out as actually a 26-volume, massive encyclopedic bunch of books with no index, so it was kind of hard for researchers to get into it. You may have seen the single volume condensed book that is available at bookstores. You can find that easily for a couple bucks, but that's only 1/26 of the entire report. So Mark Lane came out with several criticisms of the job that the Warren Commission did, and just by going over the track titles, this will kind of give you an idea of what his criticisms were. By the way, this is on a weird record label called Happening, which I don't really know much about. And there's really very little information on here. Catalog numbers, all that sort of thing. Well, I guess there's a catalog number. 3210, okay. Side A, the introduction, the single bullet theory. So Mark Lane is the gentleman who popularized the so-called magic bullet theory. Not the theory itself, but criticizing the idea that the magic bullet theory was kind of crazy. Known as Commission Exhibit 399. Supposedly, this bullet went through Kennedy's back, came out either his throat or his shoulder, then went into Governor Connolly. Texas Governor Connolly was sitting in front of Kennedy in the seat. It went through Connolly's back, came out his chest, damaged some ribs, then it went through his wrist. How do you get a bullet through a wrist without hitting a bone? I don't know. My wrist is all bone. Went through his wrist, then it lodged in his leg. And it stayed in his leg for a couple hours. And then while he was laying on a gurney at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, it just popped out. I don't know how many of you have been shot with bullets. I haven't, but it's extremely rare. It may have never happened in history before for a bullet to just pop out of somebody with no blood, no mess, no pain, no knowledge by the person that it popped out of. So the so-called magic bullet did all those things, went through all those people, sat in his leg, popped out, and landed right on the gurney in the hallway where it was spotted by a passerby. It didn't fall under his leg like you might expect. If you dropped a bullet on your leg, it would kind of go under or under a sheet. It was just sitting there in plain sight. Somebody picked it up. I don't know who. Hey, this magic bullet did all that damage. So that's a central part of the thesis of the Warren Commission, that this one magic bullet did a lot of damage. And if you believe that there was more than one shooter, that's part of the whole thing about that bullet doing too many things for one little bullet to come out completely unscathed and not have, a lot of marks on it. Usually when a bullet hits bone, it fragments and changes shape. Anyway, so Mark Lane is the originator in popular culture of the single bullet theory, or the criticism of the magic bullet theory, or as Seinfeld episode once called it, the magic loogie, if you know that joke. Let me just show you a couple of the other tracks here, because each one sort of takes a big chunk of the commission report. Medical items, commissioner's ability to examine all the relevant data and witnesses. So the Warren Commission did not look at the x-rays of Kennedy, and I don't think they looked at the autopsy report. And, these are things that he gets into. Listen to the record. You'll hear all the detail he goes into. The Zapruder film. The famous Zapruder film, also the subject of a lot of controversy, because the commission published some of the images of the Zapruder film, some of the still frames, and then Time magazine published some of them. But it was later revealed that they dropped some of the frames and they put them out of order. So the order, the key sequence, when the head is moving back and forth, the order of the frames, is it moving this way or that way, is very critical. And eventually, Time magazine said, oh, we're sorry, we lost some of the frames. One of the technicians dropped the film and stepped on and ruined some of the frames. So we couldn't, we didn't include those, and oops, sorry, we put them out of order. Well, kind of sounds a little fishy. And Mark Lane is excellent at making things sound fishy, even if they aren't fishy. One of the things that I criticize Mark Lane about is the so-called puff of smoke in the grassy knoll. Again, to credit Mark Lane, he popularized the phrase grassy knoll, which is now part of kind of common usage. The grassy knoll, the fence where supposedly shots actually came from, according to Mark Lane, and a puff of smoke. I would agree with Lane's critics that modern ammunition does not emit giant puffs of smoke. If you've ever been to a shooting range, it's not covered in smoke. Okay, you wouldn't be able to breathe at a shooting range. Most powder in the modern era is smokeless. And then he says, well, it was an archaic rifle. Well, the rifle has very little to do with what ammunition is in it. Anyway, that's one of my criticisms of Mark Lane. But otherwise, stay tuned. I want you to understand the significance of what Mark Lane did and how the world reacted to him. Okay, let's see. FBI. So one of the things that I mentioned that they didn't review the autopsy photographs. They didn't review the x-rays. How could they not review these things? Well, they were, in order to protect the family. That's what they kept using, that excuse over and over. We can't release the documents to protect the family. The Warren Commission can't look at the x-rays to protect the family. The Warren Commission can't look at the autopsy photos to protect the family. Well, what'd they look at? Well, they looked at an artist's rendition who looked at the photos and then scribbled something together and then handed it to them. So the whole autopsy, you gotta listen to the record. You gotta read the book. There's so many little bits and pieces that are very fishy. And so Mark Lane pummels the Warren Commission in book, in movie, on recorded testimony like this about how many mistakes they made. And he comes forth with the theory that the Warren Commission didn't really want to investigate. They just wanted to prove that Oswald did it. And they filled up those 26 volumes with a lot of nonsense that is not really relevant to the case. At one point on the record, he talks about x-rays of Jack Ruby's mother's teeth. Why was that included in the Warren Commission report? But interviewing key witnesses was not included. There were dozens, 50, 100, maybe 500 witnesses in Dealey Plaza that day. And many of them, maybe hundreds of them, said, yeah, I heard something come out of the grassy knoll. I saw a flash over there. And those people were not, for the most part, interviewed, or their testimony was altered and not interviewed. So in the movie, for example, which is available on YouTube, and this disc is also available on YouTube. In the movie, he interviews those people. He goes back to the people that were there and interviews them and said, "Well, yeah, I saw a puff of smoke right over there. I heard it come over there. Well, did the Warren Commission ask you that? No, they didn't call me as a witness." So over and over and over, dozens and dozens of witnesses whose testimony that he takes from them does not match what appears in the Warren Commission report. Let me just double check real quick. Yeah, there's a whole issue about photographs that were altered or cropped or faked, photographs of Oswald and so forth. Okay, so what was the reaction to this thing? The Rush to Judgment book made it to the New York Times #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It remained on the bestseller list for something like 29 weeks. And then things started to change because Mark Lane wrote lots of other books that for some reason didn't make it into public view. I mean, they might have been published, but he couldn't get big publishers to publish them. He couldn't get big-time newspapers or TV shows to interview him. They certainly embraced him for the first, few months or year after the book came out. But after that, what changed? Why was he suddenly persona non grata? And one of the answers is a document that came out. Well, I think I told you that the book and the movie came out like 1967. In getting my dates correct here, guys. April of 1967. A very famous memo came out of the CIA, which was not released for a decade or so, but you can look that up. I may provide a link to it. Memo 1035-960, which basically has the CIA talking to its media assets. It literally uses that phrase, assets in the media, and tells them we must, stop this conspiracy discussion. We must make sure that everybody believes the Warren Commission report. It names Mark Lane by name. It directs the CIA agents to talk to their friends and assets in the media, and it uses the word propaganda, and it basically tells everyone in the media who's a friend of the CIA that we must shut down all this conspiracy talk. And so that memo is very key to understanding how the media approach to this whole thing changed. Now, are you telling me that the CIA has assets in the media? And it talks about editors and book reviewers and politicians who are friendly to the CIA. This memo 960, I should do a whole video on that. But yes, the CIA had plenty of relationships with high-ranking media officials at many of the most famous newspapers and TV networks and radio and so forth in the U.S. and abroad. And maybe you've never even heard of this, but look it up. Operation Mockingbird. Mockingbird is somebody who basically repeats what they're told. And the CIA had low estimates are 400, high estimates are in the thousands of journalists and media people on the payroll whose job it was to repeat whatever narrative the CIA or the executive branch was trying to foist on the American people. A lot of it was focused on counteracting the anti-war movement. That was one of the CIA's biggest functions in the 60s. Anybody who's anti-war, we've got to attack them. We've got to embarrass them. We've got to besmirch their reputation. And Mark Lane was certainly the victim of that. So that's kind of part of the importance of where he is in the modern media landscape. Is some people say this 1035-960 memo was the CIA weaponizing the term conspiracy theorist. And Snopes said, well, that's not true because the word conspiracy theorist doesn't even appear in the memo. No, it doesn't. The phrase conspiracy theories appears in the memo. And you didn't mention that, Snopes, and you didn't mention Operation Mockingbird, Snopes. So Snopes is also compromised media, believe it or not. Yeah, it is. Greg, you sound like a raving lunatic. That's okay. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. So let me just go a little further in Mark Lane, this gentleman. He's not pictured here. That's President Kennedy. But so you see the name, so you see the cover. Mark Lane, who has since died. He's died, he was age 89. I don't know how many years ago that was, but he was involved in many famous cases and situations. So I want you to understand the impact he had on the media and on the government's relationship with the media, okay? Which I think I spelled out a little bit in this whole Operation Mockingbird thing. Okay, so he was, Mark Lane was one of the researchers working closely with Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison was, of course, the subject of the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. Mark Lane came out as a critic of Oliver Stone, because Oliver Stone's movie about Jim Garrison talks about the prosecution of a gentleman named Clay Shaw in Louisiana. And Clay Shaw was acquitted of involvement in a conspiracy to kill the president. And so Mark Lane says, well, you shouldn't be doing a movie that falsely paints Clay Shaw at the center of this thing. So a little bit of a rift. I mean, they have a lot of respect for each other, those gentlemen, but he also discusses the fact that the original script really was more about the CIA, and when powers that be got a hold of the script, they watered it down and changed it to, let's pin it on Clay Shaw. And then when Clay Shaw was acquitted, well, that kind of kills the theory a little bit. So, by the way, this the book and this record do not talk about who may have shot or who may have been involved in the conspiracy. It really just focuses on the forensic evidence, the witnesses at the scene of the crime, the bullets, the autopsy, the x-ray, all that stuff. But that was 1967. As years go on, Lane continues his research, and he continues to try to get that message out to people. And he was instrumental in something that happened a decade later. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was about 1976. Checking my notes to keep the dates straight for you guys. House Select Committee on Assassinations, where Congress reopened the investigation both on JFK and on Martin Luther King. And Mark Lane was one of the sort of essential people. That thing wouldn't have even happened had he not been beating this drum for a long time. At the end of the day, the House Select Committee said, yeah, we think there was probably a conspiracy, but we're not sure who. And the whole thing was a mess. And there are researchers who've said, well, the whole thing was a mess because the CIA did a great job of shutting down their research, hampering their research. Some key witnesses didn't make it to testify under some unusual circumstances. Believe it or not, yeah. Uh-oh. Who kicked the camera? Who kicked the camera? It wasn't me. That was 1976. 2 years later, something very strange in American history happened. Let's talk about the Jonestown Massacre in Guyana. Guyana is a country in South America, bordering Venezuela, and has some strategic importance in areas of mining that are what we call U.S. interests. Jim Jones, very strange character. We now have evidence of CIA's involvement in Jonestown. That's not the topic I want to get into here. I want to talk about Mark Lane. Mark Lane was invited by Jim Jones to come down to Guyana to survey things. And Jim was like, hey, I'm getting all this bad press, that I'm a terrible cult leader. I'm just a pastor. I'm just a nice guy. People are saying they can't leave and they're kept here under duress and they're forced to do weird things. Mark Lane, you're a great, well-known researcher. Come down to Guyana so you can, help investigate and show the world that I'm a nice guy and everything's fine here. And likewise, in that entourage, a famous politician, a congressman named Leo Ryan, went with him. Leo Ryan was a congressman from here in California, Bay Area, I think. Democrat, obviously. Leo Ryan was one of the CIA's biggest critics in Congress, and he had previously authored and passed a bill called the Ryan-Hughes Amendment, or is the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, that basically put a lot of restrictions on what the CIA could do in terms of covert operations without getting either presidential or congressional approval. So Leo Ryan and Mark Lane, two guys, very vocal CIA critics, go down to investigate and see what's going on in Guyana with Jim Jones. While they were there, just a few days later, of course, the massacre happened. The massacre happened. 906 people or so died, cyanide poisoning, and many were shot while these two guys were there. But you may not know this if you don't know your history that well. Leo Ryan, the congressman, was actually assassinated along with a lot of people in his entourage. Mark Lane was taken at gunpoint and imprisoned for a while by rebels or something. It's very complicated because, you know, there was a lot of shooting and yelling and screaming and dying during all this massacre and ambush and stuff. But Leo Ryan and a journalist cameraman or sound man was killed. So that was an assassination. That was the second assassination in U.S. history of a congressman who was in office. One of the CIA's biggest critics. In an operation that killed 900 people that we now know has some very strange ties to the CIA. So I'm just painting a picture of where Mark Lane has been in history, areas you might not be aware of. And Mark Lane was involved in a lot of, I mean, he was like a civil rights lawyer and a researcher and a lecturer. But another famous case he was involved in, now into the 80s and 90s, he starts talking about the CIA in terms of a book and a court case. So there was a gentleman, a CIA guy named E. Howard Hunt, you may have heard of. He was part of the Watergate break-in burglars. He was a guy known to be part of regime change and government overthrow in South America. That was kind of the business the CIA was in back then. Overthrowing elections, interfering with elections, assassinating people, assassinating presidents all over Africa and South America. Why wouldn't they, if they would do that in 20 countries in South America and Africa, why wouldn't they do that in the U.S.? I don't know. You think about that. So anyway, E. Howard Hunt was accused by many people of being part of the CIA, part of the Kennedy assassination team. A newspaper that published this was sued for defamation by Hunt. He won, got a $650,000 judgment, but then there was, for some reason, that was appealed and retried. I don't know all the details. But at that point, Mark Lane became the attorney representing the newspaper that had supposedly defamed E. Howard Hunt. Hunt basically admitted he had no alibi very early on in the trial. And at that point, Mark Lane said, well, we got this in the bag. We know we're going to win this case, but we still have, lots of witnesses. So let's push this thing forward and use this case to put the CIA on trial. So in that case, Lane won, and a jury basically said, yeah, the CIA killed Kennedy. The jury foreman came out in front of the cameras, the TV cameras, and said, yeah, I'm an impartial juror. I didn't believe any of this stuff. But after hearing Mark Lane's case, yeah, we all believe now that the CIA killed Kennedy and Hunt is guilty. And supposedly Hunt made a deathbed confession to his son. That's obviously questioned by some people, but a lot of people were waiting for Hunt to, see if he would make that, relieve himself of some guilt and make that confession on his deathbed. Supposedly he did, but people question that. Anyway, this raving lunatic, I hope I've enlightened you a little bit about the importance of this record. Mark Lane, Rush to Judgment. You can listen to this entire record on YouTube. And as part of promoting the book and the record, he made something like 80 or 85 lectures at universities across America. And this record is very similar to the basic lecture that he gave. He's a very great orator. He's funny. He knows how to make points. He knows how to use rhetoric to really paint his opponents into a corner. So he's very good at that. But just because you're a talented orator, whether the stuff you're saying is true, two different stories. So I encourage you to listen to some of this record or some of his other lectures online. Keep an open mind, and keep an open mind in terms of what you're seeing from the media. Now that you know that the media and the government does a great job of lying to you on a regular basis, and many of the lies have to do with, hey, we like to have wars. We love the military-industrial complex. We need to keep the war machines singing at all times. Oh, yeah, let me go back and more history. You guys want more history? You're probably sick of this, but okay. President Truman created the CIA as a way of gathering information so the president could have the best information at his fingertips in time of war. That was World War II. After World War II, Eisenhower became president. Eisenhower ran the war machine. He was the commander of the Allied forces in World War II, right? I think. But at his farewell address, very famous farewell address, he said, we must guard ourselves from undue influences of the military-industrial complex. The original draft of that speech said the Congressional Military-Industrial Complex, but it was shortened. We call it MIC sometimes. What is the military-industrial complex anyway? Right around that time, no, actually, let's fast forward. Kennedy had a very rocky relationship with the CIA. He said he wanted to blast the CIA into a million pieces. When Robert Kennedy learned about the assassination within minutes, he said, who did it? The CIA? Okay. We have people who've stated that that's exactly what Robert Kennedy said. A month after the assassination, Truman wrote an op-ed piece, I think it was published in the Washington Post, saying, I should never have given the CIA this much power. They need to be reined in. They need to not have arms and weapons and air forces. They need to just be an information gathering machine. That was a month after Kennedy assassination. And Dulles, head of the CIA, former head of the CIA, went down to Missouri and talked to Truman and said, you've got to retract this. Can you please, lighten up on this statement? And Truman refused, but Dulles kind of faked a retraction anyway. Dulles, by the way, was on the Warren Commission. Why is a former CIA guy on the Warren Commission? Well, back then, anyway, guys, I've raved enough for a half hour. Go ahead and listen to this record online. And go ahead and look up some of those memos. I'll put them in some links for you below. This record is more important than worrying about what pressing and what record plant and who mastered it. And, there's some things more important, believe it or not. And that's it. Let me know what you think. Or just go back to listening to your nice audiophile pressings. Whatever. Later.